Europeo. Christine Lagarde hablando en estos momentos después del revés histórico a Donald Trump.
Tom Beers. All of you, esteemed guests, family members, friends, young and not so young economists. I'm in the latter category, rest assured. And all those who don't feel included by my address. Let me tell you how honored and privileged I feel receiving this award from your association. I feel particularly privileged because I had the honor to meet Paul Volcker on several occasions. And not to mention the fact that he was just the tallest economist I had met in my life. I was most impressed by his steady hand, wisdom, humility, sagacity, and when discussing with him certain innovation that we were seeing in the making, he was always constantly humble to the point where he would say, you know, since plastic cards, I'm not sure that much has happened in terms of innovation in monetary policy and in financial markets. I think he was trying to reassure me that we should not venture in two moving parts of the innovation field that was just opening up at the time. So I'm all that, humbled, honored, and it's with a big heart that I accept this recognition. And I will address him in my introduction to remarks that are more economically rooted. And I'm humbled because you have actually referred to Michel de Montaigne and to Albert Camus. And I'm going to borrow from another one, who is not French actually, who is Russian. Because there is perhaps no greater question in political philosophy than to decide whether history is shaped by individuals or by the forces that carry them. And that is a topic that Tolstoy addressed square on with War and Peace. And his answer was uncompromising. The so-called great men of history were not its authors, but its instruments. That was Tolstoy's view. And this is a powerful thesis. But in the history of economic institutions, the evidence points both ways, which is very handy because typically you have the one hand and the other hand. And that is exactly what we could conclude. Institutions are shaped by the laws they are built upon and the mandates they are given, but they are also shaped, and sometimes decisively, by the people who serve them. And perhaps is that no clearer than in the story of Paul Volcker, whom this lecture honors. What Chair Volcker did in the early 80s went beyond taming inflation. He transformed the character of the Federal Reserve System. Before he came along, the Fed's independence had been established, in principle, by the US Treasury Federal Reserve Accord in 1951. So there was the law that shaped the institution. But it had not always been defended with equal vigor. Arthur Burns had given a lecture on what he called the anguish of central banking, an argument in essence on why central banks could not be expected to control inflation against the weight of political pressure. Volcker offered no such apology. He raised rates to levels that induced deepest recession since the 1930s and came as a result under sustained political attack. His act of personal conviction changed the trajectory of central banking, not only in this country, the United States, but worldwide. And I would say that it is the very same tradition that my friend Jay Powell has upheld with such resolve. Their efforts serve as an important reminder that while we need legal frameworks to ensure central bank independence, frameworks alone are never enough. Laws can be rewritten, mandates reinterpreted, institutional norms hollowed out. Independence ultimately has to live in the culture and conviction of the people who serve these institutions, because sooner or later, the legal limits will be tested. Europe, of course, has been accused of lacking precisely this kind of decisiveness. US Treasury Secretary Bessent captured the sentiment recently with his quip about the dreaded European Working Group. It is a familiar charge, and not always an unfair one, don't get me wrong. Too often, Europe has allowed itself to become entangled in its own procedures. Progress has been blocked by the need for unanimity, slowed by the impulse to harmonize every detail across 27 different countries, and frustrated by an instinct to regulate before we innovate. These are real problems, and Europeans know it. Some of this is inevitable because it is the result of how the European Union was built. It was conceived to require compromise, diffuse authority, and ensure that no single country leader could impose its will on the others. That was a deliberate choice, born of a continent where the unchecked power of individual states had too often led to catastrophe. But the idea that this structure condemns us to inaction is wrong. And the clearest evidence of this is the institution that I'm honored to represent, the European Central Bank. With all its members, the ECB's Governing Council, we are 27 around the table, 27. 21 governors of each member state, part of the euro area, plus 6 members of the executive board, including its president. And that makes us, by far, the largest monetary policy committee among the major central banks. The Federal Reserve has 12 voting members. The Bank of England and the Bank of Japan have 9 each. We are 27. Now, one might expect a structure of this size to result in inertia. But in practice, I would contend that it gives us very distinctive strength. First, it makes us harder to influence. A decision forged on the basis of 27 informed perspectives is harder to reach, but it is also far more difficult for any single government to influence or reverse under pressure. And this is, by the way, particularly the case given that we do not single out those who dissent and we do not identify those who vote one way or the other. So that very structure reinforces, in my view, our independence. Second, our diversity is an asset in times of high uncertainty. Each member of the Governing Council brings a different assessment of how the economy is evolving, how monetary policy is transmitting, and where the risks lie. Taken together, these perspectives form a natural distribution around the central forecast, mapping the uncertainty in a way that no single decision maker can. So when you're confronted with a pandemic, an energy crisis, a war, and a reconfiguration of global trade within a space of a few years, that diversity becomes a form of institutional insurance. Third, none of this comes at the cost of speed. When the pandemic struck, we designed and launched a 750 billion euros emergency asset purchase program within days, not weeks, days. When inflation surged, we raised rates by 450 basis points in a little over a year. That was the fastest tightening cycle in the ECB's history. And we then cut again by 200 basis points as inflation stabilized at our medium-term target. Of course, monetary policy is a special domain. We have a clear mandate to guide our decisions, whereas lawmakers face more competing objectives. But the wider the European Union has also shown that it can act when confronted with urgent crisis. Let me take the pandemic again as an example. Our monetary response was made far more effective by the decision of the European Union leaders to create the Next Generation EU program, a 750 billion euros common fiscal instrument agreed within months and financed through joint borrowing. A program such as this would have been just unthinkable a year earlier. The question today is whether Europe can act not only under pressure of crisis, but also on the structural issues that determine long-term growth. But the argument that Europe is incapable of this kind of change, that our procedures condemn us to stagnation, is being tested against the evidence. And pay attention. This evidence is starting to tell a slightly different story in three key areas, and those are the three key areas that I would like to take you through. The first area is in the composition of demand. For much of the past 15 years, the euro area relied heavily on the rest of the world to generate growth. Open continent, high level of trade, in and out. After the global financial crisis, domestic demand as a share of GDP fell to the bottom of the range amongst advanced economies. At the same time, the current account shifted from being broadly balanced to showing persistent surpluses. Fiscal policy played an important role. Between 2009 and 2019, the euro area cyclically adjusted fiscal stance averaged at a surplus of 0.2 percentage point of GDP, compared with a deficit of almost 3.7% in the United States. Inadequate domestic demand was identified by our US partners long before relations became a bit more complicated. Today, Europeans widely recognize that this model has run its course. It presents two fundamental problems. First, we now operate in a world in which our largest single export market is subject to tariffs, or some tariffs. And where our third largest export market, China, is running a trade surplus of around $1.2 trillion. So in such an environment, external demand that we much relied upon is inevitably less reliable. Over the next 3 years, our staff expect exports to expand at roughly half the historical average pace. So that's problem number one. Problem number two, this model has meant exporting our savings at a time when we face substantial investment needs at home. US capital markets now account for roughly 1/3 of euro area residents' holdings of listed equities, a share comparable to that invested domestically. These investments have generated significant income gains. In 2025 alone, euro area investors earned almost 200 billion from their US equity holdings, or around 1.3% of GDP. But the broader return, not the instant gratification, the broader returns in productivity gains, in innovation, accrue where the investments is made and the capital deployed. And this has overwhelmingly been in the United States. As an example, if the euro area were to deploy some of that capital productively at home, enough to close just 1/4 of the productivity gap with the United States, the gains for the economy could be in the order of $500 billion per year. That is more than twice the income earned in those foreign investments. Remember, 200 billion. Yet, we are beginning to see a shift. Last year, euro area growth reached 1.5%, its strongest performance in 3 years, despite rising trade tensions. This growth was not driven by external demand. This growth was driven entirely by domestic demand, with net export actually subtracting 0.5 percentage point. Europe's geopolitical needs and macroeconomic interests now point both in the same direction. The investment required for security, for resilience, will also strengthen our domestic growth. Government spending on defense and infrastructure is rising markedly while simultaneously supporting private investment. AI, that I know you discussed earlier today, is providing an additional tailwind. Private digital investment has risen by almost 20% since 2020. And our survey of large European corporates points to ongoing strong growth in AI-related spending. And that momentum is likely to be sustained. Much of the increase in defense spending lies ahead, and investment in data centers and energy grids is now moving into the implementation phase. Overall, between 2026 and 2028, investment is projected to account for almost 40% of euro area growth, well above its historical average of around 25%, representing more than 150 billion in additional cumulative investment. Now, while these investments are being made to promote Europe's own growth and resilience, they also support a more balanced relationship with our trading partners. The very subject that will be addressed by G7 and G20 presidency this year. The current account surplus fell to 1.6% of GDP in 2025, down from 2.7% in 2024, and we project it to remain around that level. A significant share of what remains reflects the saving behaviors of, unfortunately, aging population. The key question for Europe, however, is how stronger demand can translate into stronger sustained growth. And I want to address now the supply side. There is a link. Eurosystem research shows that aggregate demand conditions play a role in productivity growth. When revenues rise and financing constraints ease, firms are more likely to increase spending on research and development and adopt new technologies. But that transmission is not automatic. Looking at the share of domestic demand in GDP in large economies, Germany has been near the bottom of the range for extended periods, while France has been near the top. And yet, their long-term growth outcomes have not been particularly different. So why is that? But the reason is that demand can only bring a sustained increase in growth if firms are able to respond. And long-standing supply-side constraints have limited their capacity to expand, to innovate, and to scale across Europe. And this is where the second shift comes in. On the supply side itself, Europe's private sector is showing that it is ready to adopt new technologies at speed provided that we remove the remaining barriers. Those of you in that business know that Europe is not leading the way in developing frontiers, particularly the frontier AI models. There are some, but not in the same magnitude and not in the same scale as in this country or in China. But if history is any guide, the larger economic prize may lie not in producing these tools, but in applying them across the wider economy. This is what some of you will call the diffusion. And this is actually already happening. Providers of digital services in Europe are reporting double-digit growth as firms adopt AI tools. And firms that have deployed AI are seeing productivity gains of around 4% on average. Europe also has strengths that are not yet fully apparent. Current estimates of AI's impact on growth are larger for the United States, driven mainly by its strength in AI-intensive services, namely technology, finance, and business services, and by much higher levels of digital investment. But the next wave will be about embedding these tools in complex physical systems, particularly in manufacturing and industrial processes. And here, Europe starts from a position of strength. Even throughout the pandemic and the energy crisis, Europe's high-tech manufacturers continued to raise their productivity while the broader economy faltered. A recent survey finds that almost half of EU manufacturing firms are already using AI and big data, compared with less than a third in the United States. European manufacturers are also ahead in the deployment of robotics, 55% versus 36%. Europe's industrial base, sometimes seen as a legacy of the old economy, may turn out to be its most important asset. And that potential is not lost on investors. If we go back to late 2024, the mood towards Europe was gloomy. 23% of institutional investors surveyed by the ECB on a regular basis expected to reduce their allocation to Europe over the coming year, while just 8% plan to increase it. By the end of last year, 2025, those shares had reversed. Just 7% planned to reduce allocation to Europe and 40% planned to increase. And investment is also now flowing into the most dynamic sectors. Last year, AI-related deals accounted for more than a third of all European venture capital investment. The pieces then are falling into place. A private sector that is adopting new technologies and investors that are willing to finance that adoption. But whether this potential turns into sustained growth will depend on reforms. Above all, on whether we create the scale in markets and in finance to allow these technologies to diffuse across the entire European economy. And that brings me to my last point, the third area of change. We received two major reports in 24 from Enrico Letta and Mario Draghi, both former prime ministers of Italy. And these reports have set out in detail the internal barriers that still hold Europe back and how to remove them. The message that emerges most clearly is this one. Europe is a sleeping giant. Its potential is immense, but the changes needed to unlock it are not. And this starts with the single market. On paper, it is the largest consumer market in the advanced world. 450 million people. In practice, it remains deeply fragmented. And those of you who operate in the whole of Europe as well, they know that. Services now account for 3/4 of Europe's economy, yet intra-EU trade in services amounts to only around 1/6 of GDP, roughly the same as our trade in services with the rest of the world. So instead of being our best friend, we are our worst enemy. The barriers are highest where they do the most damage: in digital services, which will drive innovation, and in capital market, which must finance it. But what stands out is the leverage. Small changes in policy can unlock very large gains in growth. Our analysis at the ECB shows that if internal barriers were as low in all member states as they are in the Netherlands, trade within the Union could increase by almost 15% for services and 4% for goods, with effects on GDP roughly 4 times larger than the estimated losses from US tariffs. And the same principle applies to capital market. European households hold more than $12 trillion. 12 trillion euros. I should stop using dollars. A bit more dollars actually at the moment. So 12 trillion euros in cash and deposits, which is roughly 1/3 of their financial assets. In the United States, this figure is 1/10. Cash and deposit, more than 30% by European households. In this country, 10%. If the European households were to align their deposit to financial assets ratio with that of US households, a stock of up to 8 trillion euros could be redirected into long-term market-based investments or a flow of more than 300 billion annually. We're talking big numbers here. And things don't change overnight, but they're beginning to move, with work underway to remove the obstacles that I have described earlier. First, new approaches are emerging that offer integration without harmonization. You will hear, for those of you interested in Europe, you will hear quite a bit about that. Integration without harmonization. For example, the 28th regime. So the harmonization route is we have 27 different regimes in all sorts of fields. Let us harmonize them. That's a daunting task. So short of that, you do things differently. And a proposal is to set up a 28th regime, not by having a new member states around the table, but by creating a single European legal framework that companies can choose to use for cross-border operations. And if you think of it, it's not that different from the logic that actually took place with Delaware in the United States. Not harmonization imposed from above, but a single framework attractive enough that firms opt in voluntarily. The difference is that Europe's version would sit above national law from the outset, offering a common standard without requiring member states to change their own rules. Second, our method of decision-making are evolving so that those who want to move ahead can do so. Member states use the enhanced cooperation mechanism. That's another one that you may want to remember. Enhanced cooperation mechanism. Another one that I would suggest is also going to be used is the simplified majority vote. But enhanced cooperation mechanism will allow participants that are willing to collaborate to provide EU budget. One example, it's when those who wanted to participate decided to provide EU support for Ukraine. Now the jury is out as to how that is going to pan out, because clearly there are a few countries, 3 member states in particular, but 2 specifically, that are trying to come in a barrage against that attempt. I think it's going to be a very interesting couple of months in that respect. But let me take the EU recent trade agreement with Mercosur. It was approved by a qualified majority that did not include one of the founding members of the European Union, France. which abstained. That process bypassed what had long been perceived as an effective veto for large member states on major trade deals. And last week, EU leaders set June as the deadline for the first phase of the Saving and Investment Union, which is another way to call Capital Market Union, which has been much talked about for the last 15 years, but for which now there is a clear deadline by which either everybody agrees to have a Capital Market Union, or else those willing to go ahead will simply go ahead. So if it proves impossible at 27, a smaller group will move the needle. This is not a break with Europe's past. On the projects that have mattered most, Europe has found a way. The euro, for instance, our euro, started with only 11 countries. There are now 21 countries around the table sharing with great enthusiasm the same currency, 82% support from those countries for the euro. Schengen, which allows free movement of people, began with 5 member states. And in each case, those who moved first created the center of gravity that then attracted others. And the same dynamic can apply again. My conviction is that it will, given the external circumstances faced by Europe and the European member states. I'm convinced that it will. So let me return in closing to my opening question, whether history is shaped by institutions or by the individuals who serve them. Europe has often been portrayed as a system in which neither truly prevails, too bound by rules to allow strong leadership, too diverse to let institutions flourish. But defining Europe in these terms would be underestimating its ability to adapt. Precisely because of our structure, we have often had to innovate in order to move forward. Today, our institutions are evolving so that decisions can be taken at scale. And when unanimity is not possible, those who are ready to act are increasingly doing so. Our goal is not to choose between unity and speed, but to combine them, to act within a solid legal framework while allowing those who are prepared to lead to move first and show the way. When I was appointed as ECB president, the question I was asked most by American colleagues was, can Europe really act? Well, I'm in my 7th year. And when I look back, as well as I look forward, after a pandemic, an energy crisis, an inflation rush, and a war at our borders, I no longer hear that question because they know my answer, and I think they know the answer. The question now is whether Europe can act with the same resolve on its long-standing structural weaknesses, even when not under pressure from a crisis. And I believe we will, not because I'm optimistic by nature, but because the cost of not acting has finally become impossible to ignore, and because what we need is not beyond our capacity. It is within our grasp. At this point in time, I'm going to pause, stop, but ask you one more minute. I would like to congratulate you on the scholarship program that you have. I am the product of a scholarship. At the age of 17, when there was no email, no cell phones, no text messages, none of that. As an American field service scholar, I came to this country, I came to this town, which did not have a metro, which had far fewer lobbyists around. And that has given me a chance to grow beyond my horizon and to enlarge my understanding of the world and my understanding of the fact that cultures, however different, can talk to each other, understand each other, cooperate, and build something bigger together. And that conviction is rooted in that year of scholarship back in '73. And I still have it rooted inside me that the relationship between different advanced economies, this country, my country, and Europe, can be based on cooperation and not adversity. Thank you.
Bueno, pues después de las palabras de Christine Lagarde, la presidenta del Banco Central Europeo, vamos a continuar mirando a Estados Unidos. Y atención, porque hay una nueva alerta máxima de viajar al Líbano en el nivel 4. Ya Estados Unidos acaba de ordenar la salida del personal y los familiares en Beirut. Ordena esa salida en el Líbano por el deterioro de la seguridad precisamente en esa zona. El 23 de febrero de 2026, el Departamento de Estado de Estados Unidos ha ordenado esa salida del Líbano del personal gubernamental no esencial y también de los familiares del personal destinado en el país debido al empeoramiento de la situación de seguridad en Beirut. La medida busca reducir los riesgos ante el aumento de la tensión y también ante posibles incidentes en la capital libanesa. Además, Washington, a través de ese mensaje que están viendo en pantalla, mantiene vigente la alerta de viaje para el Líbano en nivel 4. Recomiendan no viajar bajo ninguna instancia y que pues ahora mismo está en el máximo grado de advertencia. Las autoridades estadounidenses están instando a los ciudadanos a evitar cualquier tipo de desplazamiento al país y a consultar la información actualizada a través de los canales oficiales del Departamento de Estado. Asimismo, lo pueden hacer desde la web del Estado de Estados Unidos. Volvemos a escuchar las palabras de la presidenta del BCE, Christine Lagarde.
With Paul Volcker. He is known for defeating inflation, but also for instilling this credibility and this independence in how central banking works. In today's environment that is highly polarized and geopolitically fragmented, how great of a challenge do you see to central bank independence?
I think that it's a principle, it's a characteristic, it's a value that we have central banks to protect, cherish, and which is critically important to the mission that we have to deliver upon. And I think that without that independence being protected, being cherished, and being celebrated, as well as protected by accountability, I don't think that we would be capable of responding in the way we have, I think, to tame inflation, to control and respond to inflation expectations in the way we have. I think it's in the DNA of efficient central banking, and it's not a recipe for perfect success, and it's not to be seen in isolation. I think that it doesn't go without accountability, and if I look at my own central bank, the ECB, on Thursday, I'll be in front of the European Parliament to answer any question that the members of the European Parliament have on our monetary policy, on key themes that they select to discuss. And I think it's a critical component of that independence. So it's not unchecked independence. It's independence with the strong consideration of accountability to the representatives of the people.
Yeah, so independence does not mean isolation. I think you said that to Parliament
That's
as
right.
well. I'd like to ask you about a few weeks ago.
By the way, sometimes people think, oh, okay, well, the central banks are in this ivory tower and they have no understanding and no clue about what's happening in their economies.
Mm-hmm.
I think that is vastly unfair and not true. If I look at the institution I know best, the ECB, number one, we have constant contact with the corporate world, whether it's financial or non-financial corporates. Number two, we go out a lot and do a lot of reaching out. And I really command my executive board members to, go to basis, go to the grocery store and understand, the fabrics of life. Because it's always tempting to, retreat to academic work and to reading forever. No, it has to be grounded and rooted in real life. And I think that's part of the accountability as well.
How important was it for you to put out a letter, a statement supporting expressing full solidarity for Jay Powell a few weeks ago when the DOJ investigation started, and he put out what is really an unusual statement for a Fed president?
I think all those of us who signed this statement know well enough the current chair of the Fed, Jay Powell, to appreciate that if he went out publicly to make that statement, he considered that his independence and not his personal independence, but the independence of the Fed was under threat. And we have all, I don't want to speak for others, but I certainly have enough respect and high esteem for him, his work and his integrity to come in solidarity with him at a time when it was probably difficult and when we thought collectively around the world that the independence of central banks had to be defended, including by showing our support to him.
Yeah. I'm not going to ask you, what you think of Kevin Warsh, which is the new nominee for the next Fed chair, but rather ask you, what do you think is going to be his greatest challenge if he is confirmed as the next Fed chair?
To do his job.
You're so quotable. Pivoting quickly to Europe. Europe has managed to grow more strongly than it has over the last few years, yet inflation has come back down towards the target, the 2% target, and arguably your forecast sees it staying around the target. So do you think that right now monetary policy is well positioned to address the inflation risk, and how do you see the balance of risks towards the outlook?
Well, I have said, and I have been quoted repeatedly, arguing that inflation and our monetary policy are in a good place. Yeah. And, I'm not the laughingstock of the analysts and the watchers, but I very strongly believe that we are in that good place, which combined with our key principles, which is to be relying very much on the data and multiple data on many accounts, and the fact that we are not on a preset course and that we will decide meeting by meeting, each and every step of the way we have to assess whether we are in that good place that I'm characterizing now, which as a result also imply that we have to be agile and determine whether something needs to be done. Balance of risk, we've said in our last monetary policy statement that it was broadly balanced, so not.
But you expressed a lot of optimism around the potential for growth, right?
Yeah.
Europe being a sleeping giant, and I think
that would make life much easier in order to tame inflation, by the way.
Yeah, stronger productivity growth would. I think when you think about the European complex and you think about this opportunity to drive growth via innovation, via greater defense spending, perhaps via a little bit more flexible fiscal flexibility. I loved your remarks on the problem that has occurred in the past is this implicit need for unanimity, this essentially consensus building nature of Europe, whereby you need to have everybody around the table agree, and it's 27 or it's 21 European members. It's difficult to make decisions in that framework. How supportive are you of this notion, and you talked about it in your speech, about the coalition of the willing, essentially this notion that if a few economies are willing to take the step forward, they should, and then they'll bring on the rest of the EU or the Eurozone?
Right. Well, two things. One is, it doesn't require treaty change, which some people assume sometimes. It doesn't. That avenue is available under the treaty. It requires 9 members to be on board in order to move forward. So no treaty change required, political momentum and determination. I see quite a bit of that. I'm seeing here and there little laboratory experiences.
Yes.
For example, at the finance minister's level, the Spanish finance minister took the initiative to bring together the 6 largest European Union, because Poland is one of them. So you have France, Germany, Spain, Italy, the Netherlands, and Poland. All together, forming a group. They're not necessarily on the same page on all issues, but they've decided to move forward because they understand that a single capital market is needed in order to move forward. It's not the only initiative I think that they will look at, but it's clearly an indication that that process is in progress and is actually happening under our eyes.
And in that context,
But having said that, there will be issues, there will be obstacles, there will be some member states who will who will sit on the fence for some, and a couple of others that I can think of who will be objecting to any of that. So the tricky approach will be to stay in these domains where qualified majority, enhanced cooperation is perfectly legitimate under the treaty.
and if you had to say one thing that would drive productivity and competitiveness in the future, because we had Ellen awarded Draghi with the Volcker Award a couple of years ago. So if you had to say one thing that would be your key driver of competitiveness and productivity growth and stronger growth in Europe, what would it be?
Just do it.
Yeah, act. But as a non-European, that's not necessarily clear because there's a lot of discussions.
I was just going to, sort of complement that. The former finance minister of Germany, Wolfgang Schäuble, who really was a pillar of Europe cooperation, while standing very firmly on his German approach to economic concepts. And sometimes, there was trade-off between the two because they did not necessarily coincide, was always banging the table saying, implementation, implementation, implementation. And that's what I mean by just do it, because Europeans can be very good at articulating concepts, designing frameworks, but when it comes to actually doing it, it is slow in the making. So the beauty of crisis, and I've gone through quite a few of those crises, is that propelled by crisis, you have no choice.
Europe grows in crisis.
So that atmosphere of crisis and need to survive together and to thrive together needs to be constantly reactivated and remembered in order to just do it.
I'm going to ask you 2 questions because we're running low on time, and I'm not going to ask you what's next after the ECB, because you recently said, and it's all over the media, that you intended on completing your mission.
That's my baseline, yeah.
Yes. And I wanted to know what this meant in terms of completing your mission. What does mission accomplished look like?
The European Central Bank has a mandate, and its primary objective is price stability, which does not go without financial stability. We have defined in our strategy review price stability as being this symmetric 2% medium term target, and we are at target. I think that we need to consolidate that. It needs to be tested against, the development of the passing of time and the development of certain reforms in particular that I can think of. That's the primary objective. We also have secondary objectives, provided that the primary objective is met. And that includes supporting the economic objectives that the European institutions have and the European member states have. And it ranges from, fighting climate change, transitioning to a new combination of energies. And it means, particularly at the moment, reinforcing security. And that applies to both defense and infrastructure, both, to the extent that they sort of complement each other. Those are the objectives. In addition to that, I launched, when I first started my mandate, the project of digital euro. And I'm very keen that we complete that and that we settle it in the law and that we start rolling out the process. I think it's important because we must have a European alternative to the means of cross-border payment and an alternative to payment infrastructures. This is necessary not as the only game in town, and I think the private sector will see great benefits in using the railguards that will need to be built, and they're perfectly compatible with each other. But I think to have European alternatives is very important, indispensable, I would say.
Absolutely. So I'll close on one question that we have a room full of young and dynamic economists. Some are a little less young, but still as dynamic. And Paul said it was the most lovable group of econ nerds. So if you
that's what he said to me this morning. Yeah.
Oh, he did? So he's remembered. But if you had one piece of advice for the audience, what would it be?
My piece of advice to the young people in particular, because those of us who passed a certain age don't need advice. We either made all the mistakes that we should have made.
We think we don't need advice.
But I would say, two things. One is to all the young economists, be prepared to take risks in your professional achievements, in your career developments. Don't take things for granted. Just be prepared to take risks and catch the hair of La Fortuna. It will take you somewhere. Might not necessarily be the solid developments that you would have expected had you stayed in your entire professional life in the same institution. No, go with the Fortuna. And then I would say, and this is more personal, I would address that to the young women in this room. Having children is an extraordinary adventure. And I'm very, very honored today that my son and his wife, who is expecting a baby, are with us today. If you defer for too long, you will not do it. And it's a magnificent adventure. Voilà.
Thank you. Merci. Yeah.
Está con nosotros Lorenzo Ramírez. Lorenzo, ¿qué tal? Muy buenos días.
Buenos días, José Antonio, ¿qué tal? ¿Cómo estás? Bueno, esa es la gran clave, que la inteligencia artificial hoy en día no es rentable. La actuación de China en este episodio de la guerra comercial.
Muchísimas gracias, Lorenzo, como siempre, por toda esa fotografía hoy abundante, lo que está en la actualidad que no para. Buen día, buen negocio.
A ti también, buen día y nada, a disfrutar y a trabajar. Abrazo.
Un nuevo recargo en la nómina. Desde 2026 todos los trabajadores van a aportar un 0,9% adicional a la seguridad social, 0,15 por trabajador, 0,75 de la empresa. No se preocupe que esto Hacienda está súper digitalizada. Lo van a quitar directamente desde la seguridad social. Esto en España estamos hablando, ¿eh? No se preocupe que ahí la digitalización no es como cuando usted pide, oye, ¿y este recibo? Oye, ¿y esto? Ahí no, ahí, ahora ahí. En la recaudación esto es rapidísimo. Aquí lo van a trincar directamente, un 0,90% de la nómina, es decir, cerca del 1%, a pagar las pensiones. ¡Ay! Pero si no había ningún problema. No, si no lo hay, claro, lo va a pagar los de siempre. Reforzar la hucha de las pensiones, garantizar la sostenibilidad del sistema ante el envejecimiento poblacional. No pueden hacer una política de natalidad, no vaya a ser que les estalle la cabeza alrededor de cómo poner medidas encima de la mesa que resuelvan a medio y largo plazo el problema, que no quieran hacer una política de natalidad como Dios manda, pero la realidad es, y esto no puede ir acompañado por un sistema claro de apoyo a la natalidad, no parece ser. Miren la siguiente imagen. Alrededor de la fotografía, un sueldo alto, más de 63.000 euros al año, deducción de 95 euros, sueldo medio, 28.000 dólares al año, deducción de 42, cuando es muy poquito. Cotización sin derechos adicionales, es decir, el dinero que usted aporta para esto no aumenta la pensión futura, para que lo tengan en cuenta, solo financia el fondo de reserva. Esto no va para cotizar, esto va porque hay un agujero. Aplicación, como les digo, automática, la retención la hará, porque en esto sí que vamos muy avanzados digitalmente, aquí no nos dejamos nada.
Muy buenos días, son las 8 de la mañana, el mundo que dejamos el pasado viernes prácticamente hoy no existe. Fotografía que podemos reproducir igual de hace 4 años a hoy, en el inicio de la guerra de Ucrania, que fue un 24 de febrero, el día de mañana. La fotografía está alrededor de cómo el mercado va a empezar a ver la volatilidad, porque vamos a pasarnos toda la semana con el código rojo, con el botón rojo, con ese código rojo a punto de apretar. Ojo porque, como les decía, el mundo del viernes no existe. En una sola jornada hemos visto la caída del imperio criminal más grande de México, un desafío frontal de Donald Trump a la justicia de Estados Unidos y el pacto secreto de misiles que pone en jaque a Oriente Medio. Pero hay un dato que resume el miedo de los mercados, la volatilidad del oro, que ha alcanzado niveles que no veíamos desde la crisis financiera de 2008. Es la semana, dicen, del botón rojo, del código rojo, alrededor de ese movimiento de la Corte Suprema que inicia la tensión otra vez en los mercados internacionales, el choque institucional en Estados Unidos y la búsqueda desesperada del refugio es la clave del día. El choque institucional tras el fallo 6-3 de la Corte Suprema contra los aranceles previos. Trump ya ha respondido con la sección 122, un arancel global del 15% inmediato, bueno, primero fue del 10 y luego lo subió al 15 porque le parecía poco, en un desafío directo al Poder Judicial que pone a la economía en una cuenta regresiva de 150 días, en un botón rojo, en un código rojo fundamental. Y a partir de ahí, la volatilidad del oro, como señal del pánico sistémico, la volatilidad del oro ha escalado a niveles que no veíamos de la crisis financiera, desde la crisis financiera de 2008. Los inversores están huyendo de las divisas y de los bonos, refugiándose en el metal precioso ante la incertidumbre de un comercio mundial que se ha quedado sin reglas claras. El agujero es de 175.000 millones de dólares. Las empresas ya exigen reembolsos masivos por los aranceles anulados por el Supremo. Wall Street teme un desastre fiscal que obligue al gobierno a aumentar la deuda para pagar las devoluciones. Es decir, el lío descomunal ha llegado. El problema para Trump ha llegado. Es verdad que la resuelto por ahora con la sección 122. Ha metido un arancel del 15%, lo cual enfada a todos, hasta el indio, hasta Narendra Modi, hasta el presidente de India ha dicho que cancela la visita. La noticia de CNBC confirmaba el plantón de India, confirma el aislamiento diplomático porque India cancela ese viaje a Washington y Narendra Modi no negociará mientras las reglas del juego cambien por decreto un domingo por la tarde. Por lo que el mercado está ante el peor escenario. La incertidumbre, pero la incertidumbre a nivel máximo, alrededor de cómo vamos a capear, cómo vamos a sobrevivir en la fotografía alrededor del nuevo mundo en la vuelta al día de la liberación, que fue un meneo importante para el mercado. Por lo que vamos viendo la fotografía, vamos a ir analizándolo la semana, por supuesto también en la jornada de hoy, pero choque institucional, volatilidad en el oro, un agujero que hay que resolver de 175.000 millones de dólares y el resto que está reaccionando. India dándole plantón de manera inmediata. El otro elemento fundamental es la geopolítica en alerta máxima. Financial Times revelaba ayer un contrato de 500 millones de euros en un pacto secreto Rusia-Irán. Mañana, cuarto aniversario de la guerra en Ucrania. Por 2.500 misiles Berma. 500 millones de euros por 2.500 misiles Berma. Rusia reafirma de esta manera a Teherán con tecnología, entiéndame, se presupone que invisible al radar justo cuando la flota estadounidense rodea sus costas. Y es la respuesta de Putin a la presión de Trump en Ucrania y de que Putin no iba a intervenir igual que lo hizo en Siria. FT dice, sí, es que ya ha intervenido. Y ese contrato que dice Financial Times, con ese pacto secreto, Rusia-Irán por 500 millones de euros. Ya les digo, 2.500 misiles Berma, con Rusia rearmando a Teherán. Y el otro elemento fundamental que vamos a tener alrededor de la jornada de mañana, con el 4º aniversario de la guerra de Ucrania, viene con la doble explosión terrorista en Lviv. Al mismo tiempo, Hungría y Eslovaquia estarían amenazando con cortes eléctricos si Kiev no permite el paso del petróleo ruso. De tal manera que estamos viendo una unidad europea rompiéndose por la necesidad de energía, o al menos teniendo problemas. Problemas el que vimos también ayer, vamos a ver cómo lo resuelve Europa esto, problemas el que vimos ayer alrededor del intento de atentado cerca de Mar-a-Lago. El servicio secreto abatió este domingo a un hombre armado con una escopeta y combustible en el perímetro de la residencia de Trump. El FBI investiga ya un móvil político en un momento de máxima polarización nacional, pero claro, todo esto está completamente oscurecido por lo sucedido en México con la caída del Mencho, el fin del capo más buscado y la respuesta paramilitar del CJNG. La clave está que tras años de búsqueda el ejército mexicano abatió este domingo a Nemesio Ceguera el Mencho, el líder de del CJNG, que murió en Jalisco bajo una inmensa presión de la administración Trump para frenar el flujo de fentanilo y de cocaína. El Mencho construyó un ejército con tácticas paramilitares, ¿no? Y deja ahora su caída, ¿no? Deja un vacío de poder en un imperio que está valorado en 15.000 millones de dólares. La respuesta fue inmediata, un domingo de fuego, 6 estados bajo narcobloqueos. Jalisco ha decretado, como les decía también antes, el código rojo y se mete en una situación parecida a una guerra civil interna, ¿no? Entre los chapitos y los mañitos por el control de las rutas hacia la frontera. Sin duda es un golpe en el que se ve la cara de Trump y la imagen de Estados Unidos detrás, ¿no? Y hay que esperar a ver qué sucede a partir de ahora, pero la situación no es fácil para intentar calibrar cuál va a ser el próximo movimiento en México después de haber reabatido el ejército mexicano este domingo a Nemesio Ceguera el Mencho. Ya les digo, una situación muy complicada en México, con un domingo en el que se ha decretado, como les digo, el código rojo y está marcando un clima de tensión brutal, también en parte de Estados Unidos. El otro elemento que quería contarles viene alrededor de la comparecencia de Zuckerberg el otro día, ¿no? Y del fin del anonimato. Claro, Zuckerberg se planta allí y dice, la solución que vemos en Meta, ¿no? Claro que puede cambiar Internet para siempre, es una identidad digital nacional. ¿Y Zuckerberg qué es lo que hizo? Bueno, Zuckerberg no tiró sin bala, metafóricamente hablando. Propuso ante un jurado delegar la verificación de edad en Apple y en Google a nivel de sistema operativo. Lo que se vende como protección infantil en realidad es el fin del anonimato en Internet. Cada usuario de smartphone tendría que identificarse de manera oficial para acceder a cualquier app y los grupos de derechos digitales ya están alertando. Esto debilita la seguridad y abre la puerta a una censura y a una vigilancia gubernamental sin precedentes. Zuckerberg lo que hace es quitarse el marrón de encima. Y a mí no me toquen. Miren, a Apple y a Google propongo delegar la verificación precisamente de la edad a nivel del sistema operativo. Y ya les digo, lo que se va viendo y lo que se va hablando es que lo que en el fondo está planteando no es una protección infantil, es el fin del anonimato en Internet tal y como lo conocemos. Ya les digo, cada usuario en el formato Zuckerberg, ¿no? Cada usuario de smartphone tendría que identificarse oficialmente para acceder a cualquier app. Pues ya tenemos cuál era la puerta, ¿no? La quercaporta, ¿no? La puerta de atrás, ¿no? Para colarse en todo este entorno, en todo este elemento. En un entorno No le preocupa la vivienda en Estados Unidos. La economía real está tocando fondo frente a la economía digital, ¿no? Frente a la supervivencia tecnológica. La vivienda en Estados Unidos en mínimos históricos. El índice de ventas pendientes cayó a 70,9, el nivel más bajo jamás registrado en Estados Unidos. El mercado inmobiliario está congelado. El sueño americano hoy parece un lujo que es prácticamente inalcanzable, y vemos cómo la vivienda, como les digo, en mínimos históricos marca el camino. Esas ventas pendientes, ¿no? Ese índice de ventas pendientes en el 70,9 nos está marcando que algo hay ahí deteriorándose, ¿no? Definitivamente. Además, vemos también un movimiento de esta semana que va a ser importante. Saben que estamos llegando cerca ya de los 21 millones de bitcoins, con lo que los mineros están diciendo que ya no hay mucho que sacar. Y hay una capitulación importante, la de Bitder, la minera de Bitcoin, que ha liquidado toda su tesorería, dejando su balance a 0 bitcoin. La rentabilidad ha caído tanto en las empresas que están huyendo de las cripto para apostar todo a la inteligencia artificial como única forma de supervivencia. Aquí la clave para el inversor es, oiga, si yo he estado en el mundo cripto, es momento de mirar, ¿no? De girar parte de mis inversiones hacia un entorno donde la inteligencia artificial, toda esa matemática cuántica, toda esa parte de la economía cuántica, va a cogerle el relevo, la robotización, los robotaxis, etcétera, dejando a un lado lo que ya ha sido un buen elemento alrededor de Bitcoin o no. Y ya les digo, Bitder, la minera de Bitcoin, ha liquidado toda la tesorería. Ha dejado el balance en cero Bitcoins. La rentabilidad, como les digo, ha caído tanto que las empresas estarían ahora mismo huyendo de las cripto, ¿no? Para apostar por la inteligencia artificial e intentar mantener un movimiento, ¿no? De continuidad en este entorno como forma de supervivencia con todo lo ganado en la semana. Bueno, vamos a ver la reacción de Wall Street al arancel del 15% cuando abra el mercado, dentro de unas horas, y a la volatilidad récord del oro. Ahora mismo son los dos elementos clave. El miércoles tendremos resultados de Nvidia, es la prueba de fuego para esa narrativa de la inteligencia artificial. Como Nvidia pinche, pues atese bien el cinturón de seguridad, bien cogido, evita el constipado como yo, que estoy con un resfriado hasta arriba, como están notando en mi voz, y perdonen las molestias, ¿no? También a la hora de contarles, ¿no? Con esta congestión que tengo, pero es el día clave. El miércoles, bueno, hoy por supuesto, ¿no? Después del 15% y la reacción que va a tener Europa y demás, pero el miércoles, alrededor de esos resultados de Nvidia, va a ser la prueba de fuego, ¿no? Para la narrativa de la inteligencia artificial. El viernes tendremos datos de inflación de mayoristas en Estados Unidos y va a haber 11 miembros de la FED que van a salir a hablar y que van a decidir el futuro de los tipos de interés. Por lo que va a ser clave entender, mirar la fotografía que nos presenten alrededor de cómo ven también el movimiento alrededor de los tipos de interés. Solo les apunto un tema más, ¿no? Alrededor de la Unión Europea, porque hemos visto ya desde ayer cómo la Unión Europea podría congelar, ¿no? Igual que está moviendo ahora mismo ya India, la aprobación del acuerdo comercial con Estados Unidos ante el caos arancelario de Donald Trump, ¿no? Y vamos a ver qué dice el jefe de comercio del Parlamento Europeo, pero todo parece indicar que va a proponer congelar el proceso de ratificación del acuerdo comercial de la Unión Europea con Estados Unidos hasta que reciban detalles de la administración Trump sobre la política comercial. Se trata de Berlange, ¿no? El presidente del Comité de Comercio del Parlamento, que va a proponer suspender ese trabajo legislativo, ¿no? Para aprobar el acuerdo Thunberry en una reunión de emergencia el lunes hasta que haya una evaluación legal integral y compromisos, dice desde Europa, ¿no? Dice Bloomberg, fuentes de caras al Parlamento Europeo, compromisos claros de Estados Unidos, ¿no? Hay un puro caos aduanero por parte del gobierno estadounidense. Vamos a ver. Pero Trump tiene una patata caliente, la patata caliente de su mandato. Los aranceles eran la palabra bonita, preciosa, magnífica y demás. Bueno, vamos a ver si no se le acaba atragantando a Donald Trump. Y les recuerdo también lo que les contaba antes, la alerta de Estados Unidos ha pedido a sus ciudadanos estadounidenses en México que se refugien tras el asesinato del líder del cártel en Jalisco. Esa alerta de seguridad que cubre el estado de Jalisco y con importantes centros turísticos, por ejemplo, Puerto Vallarta o Guadalajara, o zonas en los estados Tamaulipas o Michoacán, Guerrero o Nuevo León. Vamos a ver cómo sucede en las próximas horas también en México y en parte de Estados Unidos. Como les decía, por la tensión que se está viviendo, como les decía, hemos hablado de aranceles, de misiles, ojo al acuerdo Irán y Estados Unidos, de lo que está sucediendo en México, de la pérdida también de privacidad digital. Vamos a ver cómo se configura. Parece que el mundo se está dividiendo entre quienes están logrando adaptarse y quienes están quedando atrás. Y aquí me quedo con una reflexión que me gustaría transmitirles en la semana del 4º aniversario de la guerra de Ucrania, pero también en la semana de los resultados de Nvidia. Jensen Huang, el CEO de Nvidia, ha lanzado una advertencia que parece que hoy cobra más sentido que nunca, ¿no?, ante la crisis de empresas como Volcker y la reconfiguración de la economía. Ha dicho Jensen Huang: no es probable que pierdas tu trabajo a causa de la IA. Vas a perderlo ante alguien que use la IA. Reflexiones sobre ello, y además les leo en los comentarios durante la mañana, porque me parece que es una manera de terminar importante. ¿Tú crees que el trabajo lo vas a perder por la IA o por no adaptarte a la IA, o por alguien que use la IA y que sea más productivo y eficiente que tú y por tanto pueda hacer mejor tu trabajo? Ha dicho Jensen Huang, el CEO de Nvidia, le repito: no es probable que pierdas tu trabajo a causa de la IA. Vas a perderlo ante alguien que usa la IA. En un mundo que se rompe y se reconstruye por momentos, la herramienta más peligrosa no es el arancel ni el misil, sino la capacidad de evolucionar antes de que las viejas reglas desaparezcan. Nos vemos durante la jornada con unos mercados que van a tener y que ya están mostrando una alta volatilidad alrededor de la fotografía de Donald Trump. Les dejo con Manuel Velázquez. Buen día. Buen negocio.
En efecto, futuros...
Está con nosotros Lorenzo Ramírez. Lorenzo, ¿qué tal? Muy buenos días.
Buenos días, José Antonio, ¿qué tal? ¿Cómo estás? Bueno, esa es la gran clave, que la inteligencia artificial hoy en día no es rentable. La actuación de China en este episodio de la guerra comercial.
Muchísimas gracias, Lorenzo, como siempre, por toda esa fotografía hoy abundante, lo que está en la actualidad que no para. Buen día, buen negocio.
A ti también, buen día y nada, a disfrutar y a trabajar. Abrazo.
No estamos preparados para el conflicto que se está planteando, sobre todo con Rusia, pero menos todavía para una desunión en la OTAN. Y Europa, que le gusta vivir los lunes al sol, pues prefirió quedarse el lunes al sol. Ahora que no le protege a Estados Unidos, tenemos el problema ya encima de la mesa. Y luego la fotografía también alrededor de Groenlandia. Darle Groenlandia significa que mañana pida Ceuta y Melilla, Canarias, Mallorca y lo que le salga a las narices. No estamos preparados. Estamos cerca de un colapso de la OTAN. Es que de esto estamos muy cerca. Lo que ha conseguido Rusia / Putin es llegar a un escenario como este. Europa no es que pueda hacer algo, es que tiene que hacer algo. Lo que habría es la vuelta al servicio militar obligatorio, chavales y chavalas en parte, al servicio militar. ¿Qué planes tienes para este verano? Me he comprado unos billetes para ir a Santorini, pues empieza a venderlos, porque te quedas en la base de Zaragoza. Aprender a pegar tiros. Santorini, Zaragoza. Punto principal de una sociedad: supervivencia. ¿Y ahora quién nos defiende? ¿Tú?
Ignacio García Valdecasas, embajador de España. ¿Qué tal? Buenos días.
Buenos días, Manuel. Un saludo para ti, para la audiencia de Negocios Televisión. Encantado de estar de vuelta con vosotros.
Bueno, muy pendientes en este lunes de esa reunión de ministros de Exteriores de la Unión Europea, en un contexto en el que, bueno, pues venimos de constatar ese fracaso de las relaciones, de las reuniones trilaterales en Ginebra, Rusia, Estados Unidos mediante y Ucrania, y las posturas que siguen enfrentadas, y entiendo que hay atisbos de alguna mejora en estas relaciones justo en la semana en la que se va a cumplir el 4º aniversario del conflicto.
Bueno, yo no sería tan optimista. Yo no sería tan optimista. Rusia no se fía de Estados Unidos ni de Trump, por varias razones. En primer lugar, porque aceptó una propuesta que Trump le hizo en Alaska, que no ha trascendido, pero lo que sí ha trascendido, porque lo dijo Lavrov, fue que luego Estados Unidos se vino para atrás y no cumplió lo que ellos mismos habían propuesto. Porque no solo ha mantenido las sanciones, sino que las ha aumentado contra Rusia. Incluso ha mantenido unas sanciones absurdas, que son las sanciones por el Russiagate, que es la supuesta intervención de Rusia en las elecciones del año 16 a favor de Donald Trump y en contra de Hillary Clinton, cuando Donald Trump ha hecho de esto una bandera para demostrar que era falso. O sea, Trump dice que es falso, pero mantiene las sanciones por el Russiagate. Y finalmente, porque Rusia ha llegado al convencimiento de que la CIA participó en el intento de asesinato contra Putin. Entonces, Putin y Rusia, el gobierno ruso, lo que no quieren es enfrentarse a Trump, no quieren desairarle. Por eso aceptan la negociación, porque además así es una forma de ganar tiempo sin ser el malo de la película, porque cree que en algún momento esto le va a beneficiar. Mientras que Ucrania, frente a Estados Unidos, lo único que puede hacer es presionarle. Intenta presionarle para que aumente el envío de armas, para que aumente el suministro de inteligencia, datos de inteligencia, y para que aumente las sanciones contra Rusia, pero sin caer en un